Last week, we did our juicing demonstration. Anybody juice this week? Anybody do any good juicing? Okay, so like 3 or 4 of you, so that was worth it. But we've been doing our juicing every day. Okay, so we do in our family, we do our juicing every day. So if you guys saw my hardcore juice recipe I had out there, we do that one. I had this interesting experience yesterday because I've had kind of on my mind, I kind of create these little juicing recipes in my head of what I want to make. And so I finally got around to making one of them yesterday afternoon. So I went, Joe had taken my dad and me over to Barrett-Jackson yesterday. And so I got to see all the cars and tried to stay out of lust and covetousness and all these things. Like I'm not the, the Bentley guy. I'm not the Ferrari guy. I'm the give me a 1957 Ford Fairlane guy. I'm that guy, right? So we're going around looking at all the cars, but I got home and I was wiped, just walking. And so I decided I'm going to make my juice that I've been wanting to make. And so it was 3 carrots, 2 apples, 2 pears, a big chunk of ginger, juiced all that up, and then sprinkled some ground cinnamon on top of that. So I drank that, and I was flying for the rest of the day off of that. It was like better than any like energy drink or 5-hour energy or whatever. And I wasn't wired until 3 in the morning, so that was good too. But but it's bringing health and bringing life to your body. So hopefully you're encouraged and seeing some result in that. At the end of the service, Pastor Tanya will come back in. We want to kind of go through the scriptures, because remember, the fast is not just about not eating or skipping certain things. There's a spiritual aspect to it. So we want to go through this week's scriptures. But the week before last, so last week in talking on juicing, sort of took a little bit of a break from the series I had started called The Secrets of My Success. And so when I say this, I'm not saying that I have achieved and I'm perfect and everything's great and so you need to be like me. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that there are some things in my life that I've discovered that are biblical principles that I apply to my life that I believe gives me a life that I feel is a greatly blessed life. That there are things, I'm not saying that, I walk around and money just falls out of the sky or anything like that, right? Like, because if that's going on, I should write a book about that one, because people would want to figure that one out. But there are things, that we can live our lives crisis to crisis and drama to drama, and drama on top of drama and crisis on top of crisis. But, and God's miracle power is there for those times where that's what our life is. But He's also given us some principles to live by that greatly reduce the amount of drama and crises that we find ourselves in. And so we talked 2 weeks ago about having the right priorities in life. When you have your priorities straight, your life goes a lot better. When you get things out of whack and you have the wrong priorities, you create drama and you create mess. You end up having trouble with the things that you've undervalued because you were overvaluing the wrong things. We find ourselves feeling fruitless because we are prioritizing the wrong things in life that aren't the fruitful things in our lives, as opposed to the things that God wants to bring into our lives, that if we'll emphasize these things, we produce fruit. That our purpose, what is your purpose? Your purpose is whatever God has in front of you right now. Well, I don't know if God put this in front of you. Well, if it's in front of you and it's not sinful, then certainly by all means, step into it and pursue it as though it's your purpose. Take a hold of it, be faithful with what it is, and God leads you on to even bigger things. Or sometimes that is your thing. If you are married, then your marriage is your purpose. If you have kids, your kids is your purpose. But there's a lot of things we're looking for, this great big picture. God, show me my purpose and this big thing, and we're sometimes ignoring the thing right in front of us. We're prioritizing something we don't even know what it is way out there, instead of prioritizing what God's already placed in front of me. That's what we talked about a couple weeks ago. Today, we're going to talk about giving. Right? That's one you don't advertise it. That's what we're going to talk about. People go, seriously? Even when I was studying this week, I know what you're going to do, Lord. You're going to have a lot of visitors come this week when I'm going to teach about giving. That's what's going to happen. They're going to think I teach about this every single week. But it's an important thing, and I have to tell you, it's a top 5 for me in my life about how I have the kind of life I do, because our household is always prioritized and had the right attitude about giving. I don't want to say always, but we developed the right attitude. We've always been givers. My wife and I, we were kind of brought up in church, and you were brought up that there's certain things you're supposed to do, and giving was one of them. But we did it, I think, for many years from the wrong heart. We were doing it from the wrong angle and not necessarily seeing the kind of fruit that you're supposed to see when you have that kind of a giving heart. We're going to look at it today. So I'll preface this by saying we're not going to receive another offering at the end of service today. But this isn't something that I'm going to talk about every single week, but it's important. We need to talk about it once in a while. We need to get our heads on straight about these things. And I'll remind you that even last week, I'm not the kind of pastor that preaches at needs. Like, oh, so the offerings must be down. That's why the pastor is bringing this up. I shared with you guys last week, 2017 was the best year we've ever had as far as giving that's come into our church. Right? And so I'm not preaching at a need. But I'm a pastor, and this is something that works my life. I want to see you having these things work in your life. So we're going to go to the ever-popular Malachi chapter 3. All right, Malachi 3 has this magical ability for many people. If you're at a church, you know anything about it, as soon as you say Malachi 3, it just has an easy way for people to kind of shut their hearing off and kind of tune out. Oh, I know where they're going, Malachi 3. But let's go to Malachi 3 and explain a little bit about it. It says in verse 8, will man rob God? You have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. Now, we're robbing God from tithes and offerings. God himself has no need for and doesn't need your money. He doesn't need money. His kingdom does, but he doesn't need it. You're not robbing him because of it. I believe you rob God because there's some things, he's a dad. If you're a parent, you want to be able to bless and bring some things into your kid's life, but they don't allow you the opportunity to do it. It is robbing you from that opportunity to be able to sow into and be able to bring blessing into your kids' lives. And so when we don't do things by his system, so I'll even begin by saying we're gonna talk a little bit about this in a few minutes. That maybe you think, well, I'm not under law, I don't want to do those things, and that's cool. No, whether you give or don't give has no bearing on whether you go to heaven. It has no bearing on how much God loves you. It has nothing to do with that. It's just a principle that he set up that he wants to be able to bring more blessing to our lives. He says, so you robbed him by not following his principle in this, and he says you're cursed with a curse. So we have to understand some things about what it means, what a curse is. Right, so it didn't say, I've cursed you with a curse. It says, you're cursed with a curse when you don't follow my way of doing things. What is a curse? It simply means fruitlessness. You can't be truly fruitful unless you follow God's system, because his system is the only thing that is truly fruitful. The world system has an appearance of fruitfulness, right? That you can attain a lot materially in this world by using the world system and capitalizing on the world system, but at what cost? And at what fear? Always a fear of losing it. Right? But God has a system that's different, that's not under a curse. God's system is fruitfulness. He desires for us to be continually fruitful. I don't have to worry about whether I've got $10 million sitting in a bank because I serve a fruitful God. I have what I need whenever I need it. People say, well, Jesus didn't walk around with, millions of dollars. He didn't need to. He knew who his Father was. Whenever he needed something, he wasn't worried. Whatever I need, I'll have it. Okay, so he goes on. He says, so you're accursed from a curse because, or for, you have robbed me, even this whole nation. He's talking to his people. He says, bring all the tithes in the storehouse. Well, why? See, now he's going to tell us why he wants the giving to go to the storehouse. Why? That there may be food in my house. It's part of what keeps the lights on and keeps all those things, and all the ministry that the church does, and all the lives that are reached, all the work we do out in our community, and feeding the hungry and taking care of widows and orphans, and all the things that the church does all happens. That the church is supposed to be a storehouse. Right? It's where you come because you need something. Right? We come to church. God designs it. We come to church every week that we get fed. That when not to teach on this aspect of it, but part of tithing is not just giving your money. Tithe, by biblical definition, is not complete until now you've received as well. You give and then you eat. We bring food, we eat food. If you want to think of tithe in the church, it's kind of like a potluck. right? We all bring, we sow, but then we all get to eat, right? And that's kind of what his house is. It's a storehouse. So we come in, we get to eat together. He says, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open up for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. How many would like that kind of blessing work in their lives, right? Again, get your mind off of just thinking this is talking about money. There's blessing that comes into your life because you follow God's principle. And so then he says this, he says, now I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground. Remember, curse means fruitlessness, fruitfulness. You know, the enemy tries to destroy your fruitfulness. And so he says he rebukes the devourer. Now, sometimes we got to take some authority and tell the enemy, hey, knock it off. Not in our name, but in the name of Jesus. But you know, ultimately, it is God who rebukes the devourer for your behalf. So I guess he's been buked and he's been rebuked. It's our job not to unbuke him. Just so you know, that's not an actual word. If you're Googling that right now, I don't know what that word is Pastor just used. I don't think it's a word. He rebukes the devourer for your behalf. The enemy has plans for destruction. Right? The enemy sets about by getting man in his own wisdom and how he's going to run things in this world, and he creates economic ruin. But how many know that when you are in God, when you are part of his system, you rise above that? And so if I can share with you for a couple minutes here a little bit of my story, you know, a testimony of how this has worked in my life. You know, that I will say one of the greatest things I've discovered from a purely material standpoint, if you want to say that, that I've received by being a giver is when economy goes up and economy goes down, it goes up, it goes down. My life doesn't go up and down and up and down. That doesn't mean we don't have hiccups along the way. It doesn't mean that we haven't found ourselves in some positions that seemed a little scary sometimes. But God has always, always, always come through. So I'll take you back to 2002. Back at this time, I had been, I think, working at the church just kind of part-time on the side, but I was running my own business. And to even back up just a little bit more, 2001, you know that when September 11th happened, it messed with a whole lot of things, right, in our country. And so I was independent contractor doing web development and programming and doing all these sort of things, which you're thinking, yeah, I know a lot about it. Not anymore. If you haven't studied it in like 2 years, you know nothing anymore. But back then, I was a guy, man. I knew my stuff. I could develop websites and programs, doing all sorts of things on the internet. And so anyway, so I had this customer or a client that subcontracted some work to me that I had been working on 3 months, all-nighters all the time to get this project done, had over $20,000 in billable hours, and got stiffed. So we had almost lost our house at that time. I mean, we were literally down to hours away from losing our house. I mean, it's going to happen when you work for 3 months, thought you were going to get paid. There's a difference between when you just didn't have work, but when you were working, thinking you were going to get paid. Right, so Lord miraculously came through last minute on that with an unexpected source to take care of the situation. Well, here, things had just got back on track again, had built up some clients again, but then they started, as the economy was kind of going down a little bit, I started losing clients, but I had one left, one that was enough to pay all of our bills. It was a retainer contract. Then September 11th happened. And so a couple of my other clients dropped off, but here we were still fine. We had this one client. How many knows what happens when you trust in one client? Found ourselves the day before Christmas Eve getting a call from the board of directors for this company that I was doing this work for to say, well, we've decided to go in another direction. So we're not going to be developing this site anymore. So now here we were with no income. Day before Christmas, right? I felt like I was in some bad movie. Right? If it's a Hallmark movie, then we were going to meet somebody and then they were going to take care of it. But before that happened, they're going to get really upset and there's going to be a misunderstanding. They're going to leave town, but then decide anyway. Let's say we watched a lot of Hallmark movies over Christmas. I think they're all the same movie, pretty much. So anyway, so we found ourselves in a position again now after just finally getting almost back on track, to being in a position where now here we were again, days away from losing our house. And we were actually finally positioned. I actually picked up some more work, and we were fine now. If you guys have had to deal with this before, we had fallen behind, but the bank wouldn't even take our phone call. And so here we were stuck. I could actually we're fine now, but they wouldn't even talk to me. And so here I was with the band at the time, and we were out on tour. I remember at this time, I think we were out in Virginia playing a big music festival with the joy of the Lord on my face, not sure if I'm going to have a house when I get home. And so we had, right before I left, I got a letter in the mail from the mortgage company, which when we read it, looked like they were saying, unless you can come up with this amount, we're not doing anything for you. So again, this is in my head, we leave. But what goes through my head all the time is, you know what, we're tithers. We give to the Lord. Why would we be in this position? And so here we were. I'm out on the road and trying to put the smile, the joy of the Lord on, so that I could go out on stage and do our thing. And it's like 4 a.m. In the hotel room, and my phone is ringing, and it's Pastor Tammy. Of course, then your brain starts going, "Oh no, what's going on now?" Right? She calls me and says, she says, I know it's early because it had to be like 2 a.m. here because I was out on the East Coast. And she's like, something just told me to get up and read that letter from the bank again. I don't know what we were looking at. It actually said that we don't have to pay anything right now, and they're just restoring the mortgages if nothing ever happened. And so we looked at that and thought, I know what I read. At least I thought I did. But sometimes maybe you're just seeing things through the filter of what you think is going on. I don't know. But I look back at these situations like that in my life and see how God is always taking care of us. No matter how rough things got for us, we always stayed faithful in our giving. Not as some sort of badge of honor, say, God, look how faithful I am. No, because we just knew that's what's right. I know the only answer to get out of the rat race we were in is to keep pursuing God's system, because it's going to work. And so since then, we've never been in that difficult of a situation again, but every situation that's ever come up ever since then that looked bleak, that looked like things were going to be rough, God has always come through, and sometimes in a way you would never think. Right? And so, and actually what we found out when all that happened is then once we contacted the bank back to say, yes, we'll accept your offer that says we don't have to pay anything, is we talked to the person whose name was on the letter that said, you know what? I don't know what it is how that file got on my desk. I was filling in for somebody that day who was on vacation, and I saw this file here, and it said that, that you had contacted us and said you can pay this. I couldn't figure out, it didn't seem right that nobody was taking care of this. So we took care of it. See, that there's things that God works out behind the scenes, right, when you participate in His system. So I would encourage you in that, and as now we look at it a little more from this practical standpoint here for a few minutes, that to understand what it means that you're robbing God from that opportunity to be able to, well, why can't He just do it anyway? Well, because He's given some instructions. Not because it's a rule, and we're going to look at this in a second, but because it's just a system, and this is how it works. You follow the directions, you do it this way, this is the kind of result you're going to get. If you don't do it this way, you can't get that result. And so go with me over to Hebrews in chapter 7. Now, I'm not here to try to prove to you one of the things that I hear a lot, and I'll just say in my opinion is one of the lies the enemy gets people stuck in, is why we live in a New Testament now, we're not under that law anymore. And when someone says that to me, I always go, yeah, you're right. They look at you like, huh? Well, you're right. You don't have to. But I want to help you understand, this is, I think, what was the turning point in our family's life when we got this revelation about our giving. So this is Hebrews chapter 7. The writer in Hebrews has just been talking about and showing us how Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of the picture of Melchizedek that we're going to talk about here in a minute and read back in Genesis about Melchizedek. But in my opinion, I'm going to say the word says this, my opinion, based on what it's telling us, is I think that was Jesus showing up to Abraham back in Genesis as Melchizedek, because it says it's a person without a mother or a father, beginning or end. There's only one person I know of that fits that bill, and that has to be God, connected to God somehow. Anyway, it says, but for this Melchizedek, this is Hebrews 7 and verse 1, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. To whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem. That's what Melchizedek means, meaning king of peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. I want you to understand something about Abraham. Is in Abraham's day, this was some 400 plus years before the law was given. There wasn't a law that said to give a tenth. There wasn't a rule established that said you're supposed to give God a tenth. There was something in Abraham, because of his connection with God, that he just said, I've been blessed, I need to bless back to God. And so it says that he gave a tenth. Now it says here that indeed, verse 5, those who are the sons of Levi, and it's almost like the writer here in Hebrews knows what people are thinking, right? It's a law, right? The sons of Levi who received the priesthood have commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law. That is their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. It's saying, he's basically telling us Jesus receives the tithes. Okay, so this is one of the things I mention once in a while here when it's connected to our giving. It's important that when we give our tithes, that I'm not giving it to the church. You're certainly not giving it to me. You're not even, you may write in your bank statement or whatever, it says LivingWord on it. But we always have to remember, I give my tithes to Jesus. He's the high priest. And he is the connection to the fruitfulness. Now, he made mention here of the sons of Levi, the priests, the tenth. They were commanded to collect a tenth. And what he's showing us here is there are two different ways in which you can tithe. You can tithe as it was under the law, which is you're doing it because it's a command and you're supposed to do it. And I think a lot of Christians, that's where they live. Right? That they give. I know because sometimes I talk to people, and I'm not, if you've said this, it's okay, because it's kind of a natural tendency we have, is to go, well, Pastor, I'm concerned, this happened, and I think it's because I missed my tithe a couple weeks ago. Or I think I was a little short on my tithe, so I'm going to give a little extra this week to make sure I cover that. That's not how it's working. See, that's our tithing under the law. The law says you give your tenth. Right? And so there are certain churches or denominations, right? If you don't give your tithe, they'll come knock on your door to come get it from you. We don't do that. But that's the law giving. But there was the tithe actually existed before, and it's when we connect, as the whole theme of the book of Hebrews shows us, is that we're supposed to connect not to the law of Moses, but to the relationship that Abraham had with God. And Abraham got blessed, and his response was, I want to bless back to God because I know he's blessed me. But I want to take us over to the passage where that happened, because there's a couple cool things that we find when we look at this. This is Genesis chapter 15. Actually, we'll start in 14. Where I wanted to take us here. Yeah, verse 18. So this is the passage that the writer in Hebrews was referring to. And so Abraham had just had to go save his nephew Lot again. And in the process had to fight with just his 300 mighty men to take on the armies of 3 nations, right? And defeats them and takes all the spoil. He's just a good kind of Christian guy. He defeated him. He didn't take all their stuff. No, he took their stuff. Right? Took all the spoils of the battle. Right? You know that sometimes what it was is he would follow the instruction of the Lord that brought him victory. That God gives you instruction for the battles you face. And when you follow his instruction, and this is one of the things you find in the Word cover to cover, when God's people follow his instruction and go into battle, they never lose. We follow his instruction. And it has to be his instruction, not just what our maybe religious thinking thinks we're supposed to do in a situation, but what the Holy Spirit shows us to do in a situation. We get victory, and with victory sometimes comes some spoils. There's sometimes a transfer that comes to you because there's been some victory. All right, so he has had this victory. He's been greatly blessed. It says in verse 18 of Genesis 14, then Melchizedek, king of Salem. This was interesting because this guy just shows up. Like I said in Hebrews, no beginning, no end. We never heard of him before this. We don't hear of him again after it. It says that he wasn't born, didn't die. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Isn't it interesting? Right? If nothing, it's at least a picture of Jesus. What does he do? He shows up and he brings communion. Right? There's a relationship he's about to establish here. He says, he was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, talking about Abram, gave him a tithe of all. Okay, so Abraham had victory, and he sees the priest of the Most High God, and he goes, I'm going to give him a tenth of all I got. Again, why? How did he know? I don't know how he actually knew that was a number, that was a thing, that it should be a tithe actually means a tenth. Give a tenth of everything that he got, but somehow he knew. I believe it's as I see in my life, when we get connected to God's grace, grace teaches you to say no to ungodliness. It teaches you the right things to do. Your heart, you just kind of know the right things to do. Good to have the instruction, but sometimes you don't have an instruction to know what to do. Abraham just said, this is what I should do. His heart was to do that. But I want you to see a process that took place here, the order in which it happened. Number one, it says that the priest, high priest, picture of Jesus, first blessed Abram. Blessing comes first. God always blesses first. Well, if we'll learn that I'm not earning blessing by what I do, he always blesses first. He blessed, then Abram gives a tenth. And then what happens after this is that there's more blessing that comes. This is the whole picture, why we want to become people who have a heart for giving into God's kingdom, is that we get blessed, we sow, and we get more blessed. Now watch what happens though here in chapter 15, in verse 1. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram, I am your shield, your exceeding great reward. I don't know how many times I read that over the years, and then all of a sudden it jumped out to me in this last year reading this. This is the first time that God refers to himself and to Abram as under the idea of saying that I'm your shield, I'm your protector. And so, well, why is that? Well, what just took place? What did we read back in Malachi? That when we are tithers, we give our tenth, God becomes our protector. But we're not stuck in the world system. Right? It could look to someone like Abram, if he ever found himself in that situation again, I've got to go to a war against a nation with 300 men, I need some protection. That God becomes your protector. That he protects your stuff. I joke about it in our house sometimes. When the kids say they need a new pair of shoes. New pair of shoes? Like under the old covenant Israelites, they walked in the desert for 40 years and didn't need new shoes. And Paul says we live in a better covenant than that. To which they say, yeah, better covenant where I get new shoes whenever I want them. But God becomes our shield. He says, in your great reward. Then he's going to go on, and he begins now to be a little more specific about the covenant and the promises that he's made him. In fact, at the end of chapter 15, he affirms the covenant with him once again and tells him all this land. This is where the actual transfer of the authority, the ownership of the land that became the promised land was given to Abraham. And I believe it all happened because Abraham had that connection, not because he physically made a decision and it made God happy that he gave him some money. No, it's because it was his heart was connected to God. God knew, I didn't even have to tell him to give a tenth, and something in him told him to do it. That means he must be connected to me. If he's connected to me, now blessing can flow into his life and to his family. I think the enemy works so hard at getting people so offended and on edge when you start talking about giving, and he wants to pull up in your mind every preacher that ran off with the money and right. He wants to bring all that stuff up in your head. And the reality is that those are just tools that the enemy has used, and sometimes those people allowed themselves to be a tool that the enemy used. Why? Because the enemy knows what happens when you get your family and your finance and your economy are tied to God's. Now he can't rob from you. He can't take from you. But you have to do it, as we just looked at in Hebrews 7. Don't do it under Levi, under the law. Do it as Abraham did. Right? And the last thing I want to leave you with is that there is a difference between tithe and there's offering. It's not just different churchy terms and religious terms we use. An offering is something, tithe is something that's kind of assumed that we should do. And you know that I preach all the time and I said even earlier, doesn't change God's love for you, doesn't change whether you're going to heaven, doesn't change any of those things, right? But what it does is it places us in the right position. If you're at a place you go, I can't do 10%. I always tell people, start somewhere. Start giving a little bit, and I know God's going to do what his word says, and because you have a heart to be a giver, he'll get what you need in your life so you can do it. But then once we get past that point, offering, over in Exodus chapter 25, we don't have time to read it here today, but I encourage you to write it down, Exodus 25 and verse 1. Moses is in a process of now building a tabernacle. Right? The people have been delivered from Egypt. He's given the law to them, and they're in a process of getting to the promised land. And he instructs them to build a tabernacle, but what is he says, because they're going to need a lot of resource. You ever wonder where the resource came for them to build a tabernacle? Because there's gold candle lampstands, there's gold everywhere, there's jewels everywhere. Where did all this come from? You know that when they left Egypt, they took all the wealth of Egypt with them. They're leaving, they're knocking on the doors, and the Egyptians just said, here, take it, just go. Right? And all that wealth that came, why? Again, God blessed first. And then they get out in the wilderness, it's time to build the tabernacle. Now, the people were supposed to give a tenth, and that just keeps everything moving. But there's a special project, something he wants to do. I want to build a house where I can dwell with my people. He tells Moses to go to the people, and those who are willing, ask them to give. See, now the offering is about that willingness. And I believe that comes when you've got revelation of what tithing does in your life, and you can't help but want to just start giving a little bit more. My goal, I'm working at, one day we'll get up to 20% in our household. I think we hit 12, this year. Like we're getting 12, 13. Like I want to get to a place where it isn't a number, it isn't, okay, when I hit this number, God's going to be really impressed, and he's going to really do something for me. But no, it isn't that. It's a heart that says, wait a minute, the more if I can get of my world into his, the more blessed I get. And so God says, okay, sometimes I'm doing some things, and I want those who are willing to now give some more to make this happen. The willingness is a connection. Now, there's blessing that came with that. We don't know all the blessing of all the families, but there is some mention of a number of the families and what they gave. That means, 3,000 years later, we're still reading about them and what they gave and how they contributed to God's house. There's blessing that came upon their household. I want us, again, I'm not going to receive another offering right now, but I want us to consider that as part of our, okay, what are some things I could establish in my household, in my family, to see better results? Right? Again, it's not about impressing God. It's not about hitting a certain mark and then God's going to start doing some things. It's about us learning to live in his system. But it's wanting to have the kind of blessing we read about, but you can't get the blessing you read about unless you do what was done to get that kind of blessing working. So I would encourage you as in your families to think about it, pray about it. If you haven't done it before, although like I said, looking at last year, I think a lot of people are doing it. But I want to see blessing. It was one of the things, as I shared last week, is to see people in our church flourishing. When God gives me a big vision of something he wants to do, and it's going to take a lot of resource to do it, I kind of get excited because that means he's going to have to bless some people in our church to make that happen. Or he's going to have to bring some blessing into some people's lives. And so I would say, as I do in my household every year, we try to up it a little bit to say, I want to be an even bigger part of what he's doing. Amen? Amen. Well, if you got anything out of that this morning, give the Lord a hand.